The tea kettle whistled behind me as I read the group chat where my granddaughter called me a bitter old woman. Still, I lifted my cup with both hands, the steam soft against the fingers that once braided her hair. As the whistle grew shrill, I remembered the college fund I built, quietly, for 18 straight years. While she mocked me online, I traced the signed withdrawal slip with my thumb, steady and certain. The same hands she dismissed had just rewritten her future with a single transfer. That's when I knew, if blood disrespects legacy, legacy goes where it's respected. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. The clinking of silverware on china, the gentle hum of the refrigerator, and the sizzle of the broccoli in the hot water. It was another quiet evening in the Dean household. Marjorie, standing at the stove, stirred the broccoli, her floral cardigan worn comfortably over her blouse. She always made the same broccoli salad for family dinners, fresh, crisp, and just the right amount of vinegar, her little signature. A habit formed over years of routine. Caitlin sat at the kitchen table, scrolling through her phone, her eyes flicking between the screen and the corners of the room. Marjorie glanced over, the same familiar pang in her chest. Caitlin was nearly an adult now, and in so many ways, she seemed worlds apart from the little girl Marjorie had once helped raise. The tight bond they shared was slipping, like sand through fingers. "Caitlin," Marjorie said softly, wiping her hands on a towel before walking over to the table. "What major are you leaning toward?" There was a pause. Caitlin didn't immediately look up. The silence stretched between them, and Marjorie felt a knot of expectation tighten in her stomach. She hoped for something, anything, a glimpse of that connection they used to have. Caitlin was so bright, so full of potential, and yet, there was something different about her now. Finally, Caitlin lifted her head, her gaze flicking up for just a moment before rolling her eyes in the most exaggerated way. It wasn't just the flick of her pupils, it was a full-on theatrical display, as if the question Marjorie had asked was beneath her. "She's outdated," Caitlin muttered, her voice dripping with disinterest. "Can someone else explain it?" The words were sharp, laced with a dismissive tone. And just like that, Marjorie felt a sting, deep in her chest. It wasn't the words themselves. It was how casually they came out, like a child rejecting the hand that had held her steady for so long. Around the table, a ripple of laughter echoed. It wasn't loud or raucous, but it was there, a soft undercurrent that sliced through the air. Tina's smirk flashed for a moment, her fingers curling around the wine glass. Marjorie caught it out of the corner of her eye, Tina's smug expression, as if she was amused by Caitlin's cruelty. It was all part of the same performance, the same facade they both wore, pretending to be above it all. Marjorie didn't laugh. She didn't even smile. She just stared at her plate, the broccoli salad now forgotten, her hands resting motionless by her sides. The noise around her faded, muffled, as though a fog had rolled in and settled over the table. Caitlin, oblivious to the weight in the air, went back to her phone. Her fingers flicked across the screen, the glow illuminating her face. She wasn't even pretending to care anymore. Her world was the screen in front of her, and Marjorie was nothing but a relic of the past, a faint presence in the background. The clinking of silverware started up again, but Marjorie didn't move. Her body remained still, her hands numb. There was something about the way Caitlin had dismissed her that pierced deeper than anything else. It was more than just a teenager's usual aloofness. It was rejection, pure and simple. A heavy breath caught in her throat, but she swallowed it back. She wasn't going to say anything. She wouldn't beg for Caitlin's attention. It wasn't the first time Caitlin had been distant. She knew better than to press it. But the thought lingered, like an itch she couldn't quite scratch. Had all those years of sacrifice meant nothing? As the conversation picked up again, Marjorie remained silent, her gaze fixed on her plate. Her heart seemed to slow, the reality of the moment sinking in. No one noticed the stillness in her, the quiet hurt that seeped through her veins. Then, without a word, Caitlin pushed back from the table and stood up, still focused on her phone. The sound of her chair scraping against the floor seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet room. "Are you leaving?" Marjorie asked quietly, her voice barely a whisper, but it carried in the empty space between them. Caitlin barely glanced up. "Yeah, I've got plans," she mumbled, already halfway toward the door. Her phone still in hand, her eyes already lost to the world she'd created for herself. The door closed behind her with a soft click, leaving only the clatter of dishes and the smell of broccoli in the air. Marjorie sat there, still unmoving, for what felt like a long time. The tension that had risen in her chest hadn't gone away. In fact, it only seemed to grow heavier, more oppressive. She wanted to say something, anything. She wanted to argue, to demand an explanation, to call out the coldness, but she didn't. Her thoughts were sharp as they'd ever been. Marjorie had always prided herself on being patient, on being steady. But patience, sometimes, can break. And something in her was breaking now. The thread between them, once so strong, was fraying. She stood up slowly, her knees stiff, and walked to the window. Outside, the sun was beginning to set, casting a golden light across the lawn. It was beautiful, but it felt distant now, like it belonged to someone else. Then, almost instinctively, she reached for her phone and dialed Harriet's number. It was time to make a change. The neon sign flickered above the door of the diner, casting a soft glow over the cracked vinyl seats and weathered booths. Marjorie entered with her usual quiet grace, her floral cardigan draped over her shoulders, a reminder of simpler days. The smell of old coffee and sizzling bacon filled the air, the familiar comfort of a time that seemed so far removed from the present. It was a place she'd come with Harriet more times than she could count, before life had become so complicated, before things had changed. Harriet was already there, sitting in their usual booth by the window. Her short cropped hair was as sharp as ever, and the crisp lines of her blazer suggested that even in a diner like this, she would never let her standards slip. She had a file in front of her, a thick manila folder that had seen better days, its corners bent and worn. As Marjorie slid into the booth across from her, Harriet didn't look up immediately, but her sharp eyes flickered to the folder as if she knew exactly what was coming. "Anything new?" Marjorie asked, her voice low, not wanting to draw attention to herself. She had a way of speaking in this place, where everything felt safer in the familiarity of time-worn booths and the hum of casual conversations around them. Here, it felt like she could think clearly, like she could still have a hand in the outcome of what was happening. Harriet exhaled through her nose, as if the question was more of a formality than anything else. Then, with a deliberate slowness, she pulled the file closer, opening it with a practiced motion. $186,300, Harriet said, her voice flat but firm. "The total balance. It's been growing for years. You've been adding to it since Caitlin was 2. Marjorie's hands curled around the edge of the table, her nails pressing into the laminate. She had done it quietly, without fanfare. Every month, without fail, she'd put something aside. Every birthday, every Christmas, every chance she got, she had always believed in the future, in Caitlin's potential. But now, she stared at the number in front of her, the weight of it settling on her chest. $186,300. A number that had once meant opportunity. And now, it felt like a lie. Harriet let the silence hang between them, knowing what was coming. She didn't need to rush this moment. "I'm assuming you know what you want to do," Harriet said, glancing at Marjorie over the top of her glasses. Marjorie swallowed, her gaze unwavering. She knew exactly what she wanted. The decision had been made the moment Caitlin had rolled her eyes at her last night, dismissing her as outdated, as though everything she had done meant nothing. "I'm not locking it to her," Marjorie said, her voice steady, but the fire behind it was unmistakable. "I don't want her to have it. Not like this." Harriet nodded, as if she'd been expecting this answer all along. She took a deep breath and flipped to a new page in the folder. "You've got full control, Marjorie. Unless you lock it to her, you're the sole decision maker. You can do whatever you want with it." Marjorie's fingers tightened around the coffee cup in front of her, the heat of the ceramic grounding her for a moment. Her mind raced. This wasn't about the money. It never had been. It was about something deeper. Something that Caitlin, no, everyone, seemed to have forgotten. The sacrifices, the years of effort, the quiet support that had always been there, ready to catch Caitlin when she fell. But Caitlin hadn't seen it. She hadn't even noticed. "And if I lock it?" Marjorie asked, her voice now a little softer, like she was testing the waters. Harriet's expression didn't shift, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, something sharp, calculating. "Then it's hers. Simple as that. The money's tied to her name. No one can touch it. But if you don't, it's all still in your hands. You're in control." Marjorie met her gaze, her heart beating louder than it had in a long time. Control. That's all she had left. The rest, Caitlin's arrogance, Tina's disregard for everything Marjorie had done, had taken everything else. But this was still hers. She leaned forward slightly, her fingers tapping lightly on the folder. "Let's keep it unlocked," she said, each word falling with quiet finality. "But I want it written that Caitlin isn't the sole beneficiary anymore. I want options. I want choices. No more assumptions." Harriet didn't flinch. She had always been a woman who understood the value of what was unsaid. "I'll have Joelle draft up a revision," she said, her voice low, and for a moment it sounded like the murmur of a conspiracy. "It'll be done." Marjorie nodded, her lips pressed tight. "I want it ironclad. No mistakes." Harriet tapped her fingers on the table, glancing over her shoulder for a moment. The waitress was busy with another table, oblivious to their conversation, but the tension between them was palpable. Marjorie didn't have time for niceties anymore. This wasn't about the past. It was about the future. Her future. Riley's future. She had spent too long being patient. The time for that was over. As they stood to leave, Marjorie felt a sense of purpose settle over her. It was a quiet thing, almost imperceptible, but it was there. She wasn't powerless. She wasn't just a relic of the past. No, she still had something Caitlin would never understand, the ability to make things happen. Outside, the sun had dipped lower, casting long shadows on the pavement. Marjorie walked a little taller, her thoughts already shifting, already planning the next steps. And as she stepped into her car, she pressed her hands against the steering wheel, her heart racing. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The morning sunlight streamed through the blinds of Marjorie's living room, casting narrow slats of light across the old wooden floor. She sat at the kitchen table, her fingers pressed lightly against the edge of her laptop. The soft click of the keys filled the otherwise silent room as she typed. There was something so final in the click of each key, as if each letter was another step down a path she could never return from. She had spent the last few days in a fog of decisions, each one sharpening her resolve. The change had been made. The fund that had been Caitlin's, her granddaughter's future, in theory, was now nothing more than a distant memory of what could have been. Joelle had finished drafting the new terms late last night. Marjorie had already read through them 3 times by the time the morning sun began to pierce through the curtains. Caitlin, the sole beneficiary, was gone. The fund would now require written application and approval from Marjorie herself before any disbursements could be made. No longer could Tina make assumptions about her mother-in-law's generosity. Her fingers hovered above the keyboard as she clicked send. The email was short, simple, to the point. We'll discuss options. It was meant to be enough for now. No fanfare, no emotional declarations. Just the quiet finality of what had happened. The email pinged through the air, heading toward Tina's inbox. It would hit her like a storm. Marjorie knew. A cold, harsh wind would sweep through the family dynamics, but it wasn't her problem anymore. As she closed the laptop, a sense of clarity settled over her. Then came the phone call. It was Harriet's number on the screen, and Marjorie felt her chest tighten with an odd mixture of anticipation and dread. "Harriet," she answered, her voice calm but her pulse quickening. "Did you send it?" Harriet asked. No pleasantries, just straight to the point. Marjorie sighed, looking at the email screen again, the subject line still there, flashing in the corner of her eye. "Yes, it's done." Harriet's voice came through the receiver, sharp and pragmatic. "You're not obligated to give a dime, and if you're smart, you won't. This isn't about the money, Marjorie. It's about you taking back control." Marjorie looked out the window, her eyes tracking the movements of the birds outside, a tiny part of her wanting to believe that nature's simple beauty could be a distraction from the weight she carried. But it wasn't. The truth was clearer now than ever. "I know," she replied softly, "but it's better when they realize that too late." Harriet's laugh was low, knowing. They'll learn soon enough. The words were meant to be comforting, but in the quiet of the room, they felt cold. Harsh, even. The world had turned, and nothing would be the same. It wasn't about the money, not really, not anymore. It was about showing Caitlin, that no one could take her for granted, not even family. Marjorie shifted in her chair and pushed the old kettle forward, ready to make herself a cup of tea. There were things she had to consider. The revision to the fund had been swift, but it was only the first move in a series of them. She would need to decide how much or how little to help Tina and Caitlin in the coming months. She could feel it already. The subtle pressure from Tina's emails, the desperation laced in each line. But that was the game now, and Marjorie had learned long ago that she could play it better than most. As the kettle began to whistle, she reached for the small tin of tea leaves. The steam curled up in the air, and for a moment, she allowed herself to take a breath. The warmth of the cup was a comfort in the midst of the storm. She glanced at the phone again, waiting for the inevitable follow-up email, the one where Tina would demand answers or at least try to manipulate her into giving more. But Marjorie wasn't going to give in. Not this time. Not after everything. The tea steeped in silence, the words still lingering between her and Harriet's conversation. The unsettling calm of knowing exactly what would happen next. Another ping sounded from her laptop. Tina's reply. "I'm assuming it's all ready?" Marjorie closed her eyes for a moment before typing a response. Short. Cool. Not the kindness of a grandmother, but the firm clarity of someone who had drawn a line in the sand. "We'll discuss options." When she hit send, she felt a flicker of something deep inside her. Something like freedom. The kettle had gone silent. Marjorie poured herself the tea and sat back, savoring the warmth. She wasn't ready to answer all of Tina's questions. Not yet. It was too early. But when the time came, and it would come, Marjorie would have a carefully crafted plan. They would learn what she had learned long ago. No one was entitled to anything. And Caitlin? She would learn that no one, not even family, was immune from the consequences of taking people for granted. She took a slow sip, the warmth settling in her chest. Outside, the sun was still shining, but it felt distant now, like it belonged to someone else. Soon, very soon, they'd all see that Marjorie had made her move. And this game? It was far from over. As she looked out the window again, something inside her stirred, a quiet determination. This was just the beginning. The air in the living room was thick with excitement as the celebratory balloons drifted lazily from the ceiling, their strings swaying gently with the soft rhythm of the ceiling fan. The smell of cake filled the space, sweet, warm, and rich. The table was set with a spread of treats, from golden cupcakes to her favorite chocolate eclairs, a quiet nod to Caitlin's love for all things indulgent. It was a small victory for Caitlin, but a monumental one for the family. Marjorie sat at the corner of the room, her hands folded neatly in her lap, observing the scene unfolding before her. There was a time when she would have felt joy, pride even, as her granddaughter's achievements were celebrated. But today, the warm light from the candles on the cake felt distant. It was as if a veil had dropped between her and the moment. Caitlin had gotten into her top choice school, the one with the expensive out-of-state tuition, the one that everyone had heard of, the one that made headlines for its exclusivity. It should have been a moment of triumph, a moment to boast about her future. But for Marjorie, it was an uncomfortable reminder of everything that had led to this. "Well, we did it," Tina announced, raising her glass of wine, a smile spread wide across her face. "I'm so glad Mom set her up early. What a blessing." Her words rang hollow in Marjorie's ears, but she only smiled back. It was the kind of smile she had perfected over the years, one that hid the complexity of her emotions, the questions that had settled deep in her chest. The smile that meant nothing and everything all at once. "Yes," Marjorie said quietly, her voice almost lost beneath the cheers and the clinking of glasses. "A blessing." She didn't say anything more. What was there to say? The celebration continued around her, but it felt almost surreal. Caitlin, the center of attention, was wrapped in her phone, scrolling, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the screen. The contrast between her grand celebration and her detached demeanor felt like a silent statement of everything that had changed between them. Marjorie had always given, always supported, but this Caitlin, seemed more interested in her own world than in the people who had gotten her here. The moment lingered as Tina handed out slices of cake, her laughter filling the air. And then, amidst the noise, Marjorie's phone buzzed with the soft hum of an incoming email. She glanced at the screen without hurry, as if it were any other message. Perhaps a reminder, maybe an update on some other irrelevant matter. But it wasn't irrelevant. The name in the subject line caught her attention immediately. Neil Gentry, admissions counselor, University of... Marjorie unlocked the phone, her heart thumping louder than before. "Dear Ms. Dean, congratulations on Caitlin's acceptance to the University of Name. However, please note that while she is a strong candidate, scholarship status is pending. We require verification of funding before we can proceed with her admission. Kindly provide the necessary documentation at your earliest convenience." Marjorie's thumb hovered over the phone's screen for a moment longer, reading the words again, a mix of surprise and satisfaction settling within her. It was nothing but an administrative detail, but for some reason, it felt like a punctuation mark to the chapter of their family's story she had just closed. She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she set the phone down on the table, her fingers moving slowly, deliberately, as if she had all the time in the world. The laughter and chatter around her seemed to fade, leaving only the sharp clarity of her thoughts. What now? The email was a reminder that Caitlin, despite all her grand plans and self-assured confidence, was still bound by the same practicalities as everyone else. The kind of details that, until now, had always been taken care of for her. But not anymore. The college fund, once a source of pride for Marjorie, was no longer a guarantee. It was a carefully drawn line, a decision that had been made without fanfare, but would echo throughout the coming weeks. As Marjorie slowly raised her glass of iced tea to her lips, she felt the weight of the moment settle in. The celebration, the smiles, the cake. It all felt trivial now. Caitlin had no idea what was coming. No idea that the future she had counted on was suddenly uncertain. Marjorie leaned back in her chair, watching as Caitlin laughed at something on her phone, unaware of the message Marjorie had just received. Tina, busy rearranging the plates and glasses, didn't notice either. For a brief moment, Marjorie wondered if anyone else in the room would ever understand the magnitude of what had just shifted. She glanced back down at the email, the words still staring back at her, the reality of the situation settling in with a quiet satisfaction. It was the first piece of the puzzle. And now, Marjorie realized, the game was beginning in earnest. For Caitlin and Tina, it was business as usual. But for Marjorie, the moment was charged with something else. Something she hadn't felt in a long time. Control. As the family continued to celebrate, Marjorie allowed herself one more fleeting moment of clarity. A quiet acknowledgement of what was to come. No more assumptions. No more expectations. And now, with everything in place, Marjorie smiled again. This wasn't over. It had only just begun. The morning air was crisp as Marjorie stood at the window, her fingers tracing the edge of the curtain, eyes fixed on the quiet street outside. She hadn't slept much. The decision had kept her up, turning in her mind over and over again like a wheel caught in the same spot. But now, the moment had arrived, and it felt strangely final, like the click of a lock falling into place. She looked down at the paperwork in front of her, a single line of text that would change everything. Withdrawal confirmed. $140,000 moved to new trust account. The notification had come through earlier that morning, the words as simple as they were profound. The money was gone. Caitlin's inheritance now reduced to a fraction of what it had been. A flicker of doubt stirred within her, but she pushed it down. It wasn't about Caitlin. It was about this. What was right? What needed to be done? The paperwork had been filed. Joelle had made it ironclad. No room for mistakes. Everything had been adjusted, locked down with all the legal precision that came with years of experience in managing trusts. Marjorie had been meticulous in her choices, down to the smallest detail. It would hold up. There would be no reversing it. The funds had been moved, and they were no longer Caitlin's. A new beneficiary now held the promise of a future. Not Caitlin, but someone else entirely. Riley Marks. Marjorie exhaled slowly as the name registered in her mind. A quiet smile tugged at her lips. Riley. The foster youth who had been in and out of the system for as long as Marjorie could remember. She had first met Riley at a local community event years ago, when the girl had been a shy, withdrawn teenager, with nothing but a suitcase and a tattered smile. They'd struck up an unlikely bond. Something about Riley's quiet strength reminded Marjorie of herself, of her own younger years. It had been an unspoken understanding between them, one that had grown over time, built on trust and small acts of kindness. Riley had never asked for much, but Marjorie had always known that Riley had potential. Untapped, raw potential that no one else had bothered to recognize. Until now. Marjorie reached for her phone, typing a quick message to Harriet. She didn't need to say much. There was only one line needed to confirm the finality of it. Executed and recorded. Harriet replied moments later, as steady as ever, the message a quiet acknowledgement that the deed had been done. The weight of the moment pressed on her chest, but it wasn't heavy with regret. It was a relief. Clean and simple. This was the right thing to do. Caitlin had chosen her path. And now, Riley would have the chance to build hers. With the formalities behind her, Marjorie leaned back in her chair, her fingers resting lightly on the arms of her seat. Her thoughts turned inward, to the future. Riley, at least, would use the money wisely. There was no question of that. The foster care system had failed her, but Marjorie hadn't. It was time to take a step back. She grabbed her coat, slipping it on over her shoulders, and walked outside into the afternoon sunlight. The streets were quiet, the world moving slowly around her. It was peaceful. Marjorie let the wind catch her hair as she moved, her pace slow but steady, as if she was savoring the air itself. She found herself at the corner diner, the one where she and Harriet had met, years ago, before any of this had started. It was a place filled with memories, of simpler times, of life before the web of family obligations and resentments had gotten tangled. She ordered a milkshake, chocolate, her favorite, and sat at the counter, watching the street outside. She could see people walking past, going about their lives, oblivious to the small war that had just been waged, the invisible shift that had happened just under the surface. The milkshake arrived with a smile, and for the first time in days, Marjorie allowed herself a real one in return. She wrapped her hands around the cold glass, savoring the sweetness, the simplicity of it. No obligations here, no expectations, just the quiet joy of a life she could still control. She took a long sip, the chill of the drink filling her senses, and leaned back against the counter, letting herself relax for the first time in what felt like forever. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. The screen lit up with a message from Tina. She glanced at it quickly before setting it face down on the counter. "Are we still discussing options for Caitlin's tuition?" Marjorie smiled softly to herself. "We'll discuss options," she thought again. She had already made her choice. It was done. There would be no more assumptions, no more easy answers. Caitlin had crossed the line, and now it was Riley's turn. Marjorie's thoughts were calm, collected, her mind already turning toward the future, to the new path she had paved with quiet, deliberate steps. And as the sun dipped lower, casting a golden light over the diner's window, Marjorie knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning. The phone rang, its shrill tone cutting through the quiet of the diner, pulling Marjorie from her thoughts. She let it ring for a moment longer than necessary, savoring the solitude of the moment, the warm milkshake cooling in her hands. It was just a moment before reality crept back in. She had known this call was coming. It was only a matter of time. She reached into her coat pocket and picked up the phone without looking at the screen. The name was already there, flashing in bold letters. Tina. Marjorie's thumb hovered over the green button before pressing it with deliberate calm. Her voice, when it came, was flat, almost unrecognizable to anyone who had known her as the warm, patient matriarch. The years of managing family dynamics had taught her how to speak when it mattered most, how to make herself heard without raising her voice, without showing emotion. "Hello," she said, her tone steady. "Marjorie." Tina's voice came through, strained with something that might have been panic. "There must be a mistake." Marjorie leaned back in her seat, her gaze drifting toward the window, the world outside moving in slow motion, just like it had hours ago. Tina's voice was tinged with desperation now, the words rushing out, as if saying them faster would make them truer. "I checked. The withdrawal, it's not possible. There must be some mistake. Caitlin is the beneficiary. You can't—" "There isn't a mistake," Marjorie interrupted, her voice as smooth and sure as glass. "The money has been moved." Tina's silence stretched for a few seconds. The shock, the realization, sinking in. When she finally spoke again, her voice was a little shakier, her tone faltering. "But that's her future, Marjorie. You've been saving for years. She's depending on you." The words stung in a way that she had expected but still hadn't fully prepared for. She was depending on me, Marjorie said simply, her fingers curling around the glass of milkshake, the coldness from the drink grounding her, helping her stay steady. Marjorie, Tina's voice broke. This isn't just about you. You owe her. You owe her for everything, for raising her, for being there. You promised. Marjorie closed her eyes briefly, the memories rising unbidden, but she pushed them away. She wasn't going to get lost in the tangled web of past promises. Not now. Not when the path ahead was clearer than it had ever been. I tried to help raise her, Marjorie said, her voice quieter now. The words weighed with years of unspoken truths. But you're right, Tina. She outgrew that. She outgrew me. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Marjorie could almost hear Tina's mind racing, her emotions shifting, trying to keep up with the new reality that was unfolding in front of her. Finally, Tina's voice came back, softer now, but still with an edge of defiance. I don't know how you can do this. You can't just walk away. This isn't fair, Marjorie. You owe her. You can't just leave her like this. Marjorie took a deep breath. There it was. The weight of guilt. The language of obligation. The same tired words that had been used against her for years. By Caitlin, by Tina, by everyone who had never once considered what it was costing her to carry all of them. She could hear the desperation in Tina's voice now, but there was no turning back. I don't owe her anything anymore, Marjorie said. I've already given. I've given enough. Tina's response was quick, a sharp retort, almost like a reflex. You owe her, Marjorie. You owe her for every moment you spent raising her, for every time you gave when you had nothing left to give. You owe her. You owe us. The words hung in the air between them like smoke. Marjorie's heart did not race. Her breath did not quicken. She felt only a quiet certainty now, one that settled in her chest and anchored her in the face of the storm. I gave when it mattered, Marjorie said, her voice final, unyielding. But you're right about one thing, Tina. I did owe her, and that's why I had to stop. Sometimes love means walking away, not holding on. She waited for a response, but Tina didn't speak for a long time. Marjorie could almost feel the silence spread between them, like a cold wind blowing through a narrow hallway. The silence that followed the truth. The silence that would change everything. I can't believe you're doing this, Tina finally said, her voice tight, the anger beginning to surface now. You can't just throw everything away. You owe her. Marjorie's fingers tightened around the edge of her milkshake glass, the coldness of the glass sharp against her skin. I'll never be your scapegoat, Tina. Not anymore. And with that, she ended the call. She didn't feel the rush of triumph. She didn't feel the weight of guilt that Tina had tried to impose on her. Instead, she felt something else, something calm, steady, something that had been building for a long time. As she stared at the empty glass in front of her, the sweet aftertaste of the milkshake lingering on her tongue, Marjorie knew she had made the right decision. She had finally stopped giving, finally stopped being the one who always put others first. The world outside was still moving, still turning, but now Marjorie was the one in control of the direction. The phone lay face down in front of her, a small symbol of the change that had just taken place. This wasn't just the beginning of a shift in the family dynamics. It was the beginning of something bigger, a reclamation of power that would echo in ways no one could yet understand. And with a quiet sigh, Marjorie stood up, leaving the diner behind her, ready to face whatever came next. The past had been shed, the future, hers to create. The silence in the house had a weight to it, like a blanket that had settled too heavy, too still, over the world Marjorie once knew. She sat at the kitchen table, staring at her phone as the seconds ticked by. The house was too quiet now. Even the birds outside seemed to have gone silent in the wake of the call with Tina. It was an eerie calm, one that Marjorie had almost forgotten. She reached for her coffee, the warmth of it grounding her, even though it felt like the whole world was shifting around her. Then, the first ping of the day broke through the stillness. It was Caitlin. Blocked. A small notification, no more than a momentary flash of light across her screen. But it stung. It was such a simple, final thing, yet it hit harder than she expected. Caitlin had blocked her on all social media: Instagram, Facebook, Snapchat. It was a quiet, dismissive act that was meant to sever ties. Marjorie had expected something, but she hadn't expected it to be so public. She stared at the message for a moment, her finger hovering over the screen, before she set the phone down on the table with deliberate slowness. No words, no reaction. Caitlin's actions were not unexpected. They were just the latest in a series of betrayals. Still, something about it left a bitter taste in her mouth. Then, as if on cue, another ping came. This time, it was an email. Tina's name flashed across the subject line. Marjorie had been waiting for this, had known it was coming. Tina's words had been steeped in anger on the phone, but now, they were calm, calculated. "You've made your point. Now fix it." The email was long, full of pleading, guilt-tripping, and just enough venom to make Marjorie pause. Tina's message was thick with the accusation that Marjorie had gone too far, that the future had been ruined, that this was not the time for punishment. She told Marjorie she had made a mistake, a very public one, and now it was time to fix things. But there was no real question in it, no real invitation for discussion. It was just a demand. The same kind of demand that had always been there. Fix it for Caitlin. Marjorie read it once, slowly. Then, she read it again. She didn't feel the rush of anger or the weight of guilt Tina tried to cast on her. What she felt was something quieter, something sharper, clarity. She had done what she needed to do. Without responding to Tina, Marjorie forwarded the email to Harriet and Joelle. "Just so you both know, no action needed," she typed in the brief message. Harriet's quick reply came soon after, as concise as always. "Understood. You're handling this right." Joelle's message was equally short, but the satisfaction behind it was evident. "Done. No issues." Marjorie set the phone down once more, the silence thickening in the air again. She felt no need to respond to Tina directly. She had already said everything she needed to say. And now, Caitlin's actions spoke volumes. She reached for the next item on her list. Riley's tuition disbursement had just come through, the first check, covering her community college tuition and housing. Marjorie had helped set it up a few weeks ago, her hands firm in the decisions she'd made for the future. Riley had no idea what was waiting for her yet. No idea that a new path had been carved in her name. Marjorie opened the envelope slowly, the thick paper between her fingers feeling like a marker of something much larger than money. A chance, a gift, a new beginning. She had poured her efforts into someone who would appreciate what had been given to her. No entitlement, no expectations, just the promise of earning it, as Riley had always done. Without thinking, Marjorie reached for a blank sheet of paper and began to write. Her handwriting was neat, almost delicate as it flowed across the page. The words felt almost like an extension of herself, a quiet reminder that this was how it should be. "Riley, earn it. You always have." She folded the note carefully, sealing it in an envelope before placing it by the door, ready to send off. It felt final in a way, like the last step of a process that had been years in the making. She had watched Riley grow, even when others hadn't seen her potential, even when the world had almost forgotten her. This was a gift Riley would never take for granted. Marjorie stood up, the weight of the note in her hands. She felt something stir inside her, a quiet pride, something she hadn't felt in a long time. It was the feeling of seeing the right thing unfold, despite the mess of everything else. But then, as she looked at the envelope by the door, her phone buzzed again. The screen lit up with another message. "I'm not done yet, Mom." It was Caitlin. Marjorie stared at the message, the words ringing in her mind. This wasn't over. The storm was still coming. And whatever happened next, Marjorie was ready for it. She picked up the envelope and turned toward the door. There was still work to do. The email arrived early, just as the sun was rising, casting a pale light through the living room window. Marjorie had already been awake for hours, the early morning hours always quiet and still. She had brewed her coffee and sat at the kitchen table, staring at her phone. The weight of the world seemed lighter in the solitude of the mornings. Then came the notification. Tina's name flashed across the subject line, and Marjorie's fingers tightened around her mug. She had expected it, of course. Tina had tried to fight it, but Marjorie had made her choice. She opened the email with the same deliberate slowness she had cultivated over the past few weeks. It was a request from Tina, addressing the school directly. "I need to speak with someone in admissions as soon as possible. Caitlin's scholarship status needs to be reconsidered. I believe there's been a mistake regarding her financial aid. My mother-in-law has withheld the funds meant for her education, and this is jeopardizing her future. Please advise on the next steps. This is urgent." Marjorie read the email twice, her gaze steady, but her heart was already heavy. She could feel the anger behind Tina's words, the desperation to claw back something that was slipping through her fingers. There was no mistake here. It was no longer a question of money. It was about control, the power to decide. She placed her phone down with a soft exhale and waited. The inevitable phone call came that afternoon. "Marjorie, you've gone too far." Tina's voice cut through the line. "I spoke with admissions. They're refusing to reconsider Caitlin's scholarship. They're saying that without the verification of funding, they can't offer her anything more than unsubsidized loans. This is your doing. Your decision." Marjorie stared out the window as Tina's voice continued, rising with the same helpless fury that had started to suffocate their conversations. Marjorie wasn't listening to the words anymore. She was letting the tone wash over her, absorbing the anger. She had been expecting this moment, but hearing it made the silence afterward feel louder than before. "I don't understand," Tina continued, her voice breaking with frustration. "Why would you do this? She's your granddaughter. She's depending on you." Marjorie took a slow breath. There was nothing more to say. She had already spoken her truth. Instead of responding, she let the silence linger. On the other end, Tina finally stopped speaking, the weight of Marjorie's silence settling heavily over both of them. When Tina spoke again, it was softer, as if realizing how pointless the argument was. "You've made your point, Marjorie. But this isn't about power. It's about Caitlin's future." Marjorie's eyes moved back to the email from admissions. Unsubsidized loans only. That was the message they had sent her. Caitlin's future was no longer the bank's guarantee. It was a loan, a debt, an echo of a future that Marjorie could no longer shape. "I'm done, Tina," she said quietly. "Caitlin has made her choices. You both can't keep coming back to me. I've done enough." The line went dead. As the hours passed, Marjorie sat in the same spot, nursing her now cold coffee, allowing the stillness to settle once more. The weight that had once been there, the urgency, the guilt, the expectations, was lifting. It was a strange sense of finality, one she wasn't sure she'd ever felt before. The world, outside her walls, seemed to continue, untouched by the seismic shift that had just taken place. Harriet called later in the evening, her voice direct as always, a contrast to the whisper of doubt that still lingered in Marjorie's mind. Do you want to release a little? Maybe a symbolic amount? Something to soften the blow? Harriet's suggestion was calm, but there was a hint of understanding in her tone, an acknowledgement of the emotions Marjorie was no doubt feeling. Marjorie didn't respond immediately. Instead, she gazed at the envelope that still sat on the table, Riley's first tuition check, ready to be sent. The envelope was an anchor, holding the future together in ways Marjorie had only just begun to understand. "No," Marjorie said finally, her voice firm, resolute. She got the symbolism already. Harriet was silent for a beat. Then she sighed, the sound of it heavy in the air. "You're right. You've done what you could. She'll learn, and the rest will learn too." Marjorie nodded, though Harriet couldn't see her. She wasn't sure if Caitlin would learn anything at all, but she had already done the work. The choices were hers to make now. She stood up and walked toward the door, her heart steady as she picked up the envelope for Riley. She paused at the threshold for just a moment, looking around at the quiet house, the weight of everything still sitting in the corners. She didn't look back. And as the door closed behind her, Marjorie knew that whatever came next, it was not her responsibility anymore. The storm that had gathered had finally passed. But the calm? It was just beginning. The sun had barely begun its descent, casting the last golden hues of the day across the quiet town when Marjorie sat down at her kitchen table again. The weight of the day was still heavy in her bones. But now, there was an eerie peace. The choices she had made had all been deliberate, and yet, the last thread of doubt still lingered in the air like smoke. She unlocked her phone, and the notifications hit her in a rush. Tina's fundraiser had gone live, Caitlin's college fund, help Caitlin get to school. The irony of it nearly made Marjorie laugh, though there was no joy in the thought. A familiar sense of something settling in her chest, something cold, like the first stirrings of a winter storm, reminded her that there was still unfinished business. Tina had posted the link to the fundraiser everywhere, her followers and friends alike donating their small amounts in the hopes of helping Caitlin reach her dreams. A simple click of a button had sparked a chain of responses, but not the kind Tina had expected. Caitlin's peers had begun whispering, and the message had spread like wildfire through social media. Didn't her grandma have, a fund or something? Marjorie could almost hear the words whispered in Caitlin's circle. They were the same words that had punctuated the family dinner so many weeks ago, but this time they carried weight, a weight she'd been hoping to cast out into the world, into the universe. Marjorie put down her phone and opened the GoFundMe page. It was sad, really, how far things had gone. It was supposed to be an act of desperation, but in the end, it was more a sign of misplaced pride. The fundraiser had reached only $143, not even enough to cover the first semester's books, let alone tuition. As if on instinct, Marjorie opened her own browser and typed in a new search, Riley Mark Surgery Fundraiser. The page popped up quickly, her eyes scanning the details. Riley's friend, a young girl she'd met through the system, needed surgery to correct a condition she'd been living with for years, but lacked the resources. Marjorie had already known about the situation, had already considered helping. Now, with the weight of everything behind her, it was time to do what she had known all along. With a few swift clicks, Marjorie donated $5,000 to the campaign. It wasn't a grand gesture. It wasn't meant to garner attention, but it was her way of turning the page. She felt no need for a thank you. She wasn't giving to be seen. She was giving because Riley would appreciate it. Riley would understand. The confirmation page popped up, and Marjorie sat back in her chair, her fingers resting on the keys as if the decision had been made for her long ago. She didn't even have to think about it. The money wasn't a gesture of revenge, though it felt satisfying in its own way. It was about correcting a broken system, about making sure the people who truly needed help weren't left behind. Marjorie picked up her phone again, clicking on the screenshot of her donation. It was quick, simple, a visual testament to what she had done. With a soft breath, she forwarded it to Harriet with the single heart emoji. Done. That was all. No fanfare, no apology, just clarity. The silence lingered as Marjorie set the phone down and stood up. She had made her move, had seen how Caitlin's friends had already started talking, but it wasn't just about them. It was about Caitlin. The truth was out there now, and Caitlin would have to face it. Later that evening, Marjorie sat back down at the table, feeling the need to mark the end of this chapter. Her way of putting her thoughts into words, just as she had done so many times before. Before everything had gotten so complicated. She grabbed a fresh sheet of paper, the sound of the pen on the page soothing. The words came quickly, her thoughts spilling out in the same deliberate way they always had. The truth was simple. Why I changed the beneficiary. Marjorie quickly wrote the short essay, explaining her decision in clear, concise language. She had never owed Caitlin anything beyond what she had already given. She had invested her love, her time, and her resources into raising a young girl who had, over time, grown distant and ungrateful. It was a simple decision to redirect the funds to someone who would appreciate them, who would use them to build a future rather than squander it. She took a deep breath, carefully folded the paper, and sealed it in an envelope. Then, for reasons she couldn't entirely explain, she submitted it anonymously to the local senior column. It was a simple enough publication, but it was one that Marjorie had read for years. Perhaps it would resonate there, perhaps not. But it felt right. It felt like the quiet finality she needed. As she sat back in her chair, the envelope now in the mailbox ready to go, a strange calm washed over her. The storm that had been raging inside her was over. Caitlin's world had been upended, but that was something Caitlin had done to herself. Marjorie's role in this was clear. She had made her choices. The rest would unfold as it was meant to. The final click of the mailbox closing was the sound of the door shutting on the past, on a chapter that had to be written, whether Caitlin wanted it or not. Marjorie stood there for a moment, looking down the street as if waiting for something, though she didn't know what. The only certainty she had was that this was no longer about what Caitlin thought. It was about what was right. And as the evening settled around her, Marjorie knew that, no matter what came next, she had already won. The world outside Marjorie's window had begun to shift into twilight, the shadows growing longer, as if the day itself was retreating from the weight of what had transpired. Marjorie sat at her kitchen table, a fresh pot of coffee beside her, but her hands were still. The stillness of the evening mirrored the stillness within her. Everything had changed. Everything was still. Her phone buzzed again. A message. From Caitlin. The screen lit up with an incoming notification. It was a screenshot from a group chat, one of Caitlin's high school threads. The messages, spread across the screen, were sharp, each one cutting through the evening air like an unwelcome breeze. Can you believe what my grandma did? She took everything away from me, all the money she promised. She's a selfish bitch. I can't believe I have to rely on loans now. This is all her fault. I don't even know why she thinks she can play with my future like this. She used to be so nice. Now she's just an old, bitter woman. I'm done with her. Marjorie's thumb hovered over the screen, reading the words over and over again. The sting of Caitlin's words was familiar now, less potent than before, but still painful. She had expected this. The public shaming, the blame cast on her shoulders. What she hadn't expected was the echo. Tina's voice joined in, filling the space between the words. We never really felt supported. It was a familiar refrain, one that Marjorie had heard over the years but never truly understood until now. We never really felt supported. The accusation rang out in the group chat. an extension of the same bitter narrative that had haunted their family for years. Tina, too, had been part of the performance, part of the charade that had framed Marjorie as the villain. For a moment, Marjorie felt the weight of those words, but only for a moment. She set the phone down on the table, staring at the screen where the messages still glowed. The hurt was there, but so was something else. Something far deeper than the empty noise Caitlin and Tina were making. There was a calm inside her now. She'd been preparing for this moment. Preparing for the fallout, for the rejection. It wasn't her responsibility to repair the rift anymore. The work had already been done. She had given when it mattered. And Caitlin had chosen to take that gift for granted. She had chosen the path of entitlement, of scorn, and now the consequences were hers to face. Marjorie's fingers moved to the envelope she'd placed on the table earlier, the one with Riley's handwritten thank you card. The one with the imperfect drawings, the shaky letters, and the tender sincerity. It was a stark contrast to the empty words Caitlin had thrown at her. Riley's words were simple but full of heart. There was no bitterness, no resentment, just gratitude, just understanding. Marjorie took the card out of the envelope and studied it for a long moment. It was rough around the edges, the lines crooked, but it was real. She reached for a frame that had been sitting on her bookshelf for months, waiting for the right moment. She slipped the card into the frame, carefully, letting the glass settle over the rough paper. She stood back and admired it on the counter. It was a quiet moment, but it felt significant. The gesture was symbolic in its own way. This simple, hand-drawn, imperfect thank you was worth more than all the empty words, the unfounded accusations Caitlin had thrown her way. It was proof of something Marjorie had been fighting for all along, that what really mattered, what truly made a difference was sincerity, and Riley had that in spades. The doorbell rang, pulling her from her reverie. She opened it slowly, and there stood Harriet, as always, with her sharp eyes and deliberate presence. Harriet took one look at the framed card on the counter and nodded. A quiet understanding passing between them. "You gave her everything," Harriet said softly. "This is you giving her the lesson, not Caitlin. Riley, though, she'll carry this forward. She'll remember." Marjorie nodded, her gaze still on the framed card. Harriet's words were exactly what she needed to hear, though she hadn't known it. Riley would carry it forward. Riley would be the one who understood, the one who used what was given to her with the respect it deserved. Caitlin's words still stung, but the sting wasn't what it once was. It had dulled, replaced by a deeper understanding of what mattered. The lessons, as much as Caitlin resented them, would continue to unfold, and one day, Caitlin would have to face what she had cast aside. "I've done enough," Marjorie said, her voice firm, as she turned back toward the kitchen, the weight of everything lifting from her shoulders. Harriet gave her a knowing smile. "I think you've done more than enough." As the evening deepened, Marjorie felt a quiet sense of peace settle in. The storm was over. The battle had been fought. The truth was clear. And now all that was left was to let the world catch up. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for now, Marjorie had done what she needed to do. She had made her choices. And Caitlin's rejection didn't change that. The calm that followed was the kind that Marjorie could finally call her own. The afternoon light slanted through the blinds, casting sharp shadows across the kitchen table as Marjorie sat, her fingers tapping lightly on the papers before her. The documents were crisp, fresh from the printer, but they weren't the ones she'd expected to be handling. These weren't the papers from the old 529 plan or the fund transfer that had caused so much upheaval. No, these were the final steps of something else entirely. Something new, something that would define the future she was building. The email from Joelle had come just hours earlier, her legal language precise and firm as always. No contract, no entitlement, no standing. It was the perfect response, a hard line drawn in the sand. The words were simple but firm. Caitlin had no claim, no basis to demand anything further from Marjorie. The assets in question, now legally redirected, were beyond reach. It had been Marjorie's decision to make, and it was now officially ironclad. Marjorie had expected Tina to push, to try to drag this out. But instead, there had been silence. The kind of silence that spoke volumes. Then, within hours, a quiet email from Tina had arrived, apologizing for the escalation. She hadn't expected it to be so swift, but here it was, a surrender wrapped in the language of victimhood. "I can't believe you've done this," Tina had written. "But I suppose there's nothing I can do about it now. I'll let Caitlin know, though I don't know how I'll explain it." Marjorie hadn't responded, but she could already feel the weight lifting. Tina had backed down. The game was over. The letter of legal finality had been delivered, and there would be no more demands. Harriet called later that day, her tone light but knowing. "It's done then?" "It's done," Marjorie replied, leaning back in her chair, eyes closing for a moment as the weight of the decision settled over her. "I've made my choices. I'm not changing my mind." There was a brief silence on the other end of the line before Harriet spoke again. "Good. You've given more than enough." Marjorie had always known that Harriet would be the one to understand, to give her the validation that had long been absent from her family. It was comforting, in its way, to know that someone recognized the burden she had carried for so long. Later that week, the old 529 was officially closed. Harriet had overseen the last of the formalities with the quiet professionalism she always displayed. There was no celebration, no ceremony, just the crisp finality of a decision that would ripple through the years to come. Marjorie felt something new now, a sense of freedom she hadn't anticipated. There was a clarity to her choices, a weight that had been lifted. Like the last of the storm clouds had finally parted, leaving the sky impossibly clear. But with that freedom came a new responsibility, one that felt right, and it was time to act on it. She pulled out the papers for the new trust, the charitable trust she had established in Riley's name. It was a clean slate, a new chapter. Marjorie wasn't going to be remembered for the bitterness of what had come before. She wasn't going to be the villain Caitlin had painted her to be. No, she would be remembered for something far more important, something that would matter in the long run. Riley's trust would be her legacy, a living testament to everything Marjorie had hoped to pass on. She signed the papers carefully, feeling the weight of her decision settle into the lines of her signature. Riley would have the opportunity to build her future, to take the resources Marjorie had quietly redirected and use them as a foundation. Riley was the one who deserved it. Riley was the one who would never take what was given for granted. It was a promise. And this time, it was one that Marjorie was going to keep. But Caitlin's world, as it turned out, was still in flux. Her application for a gap year had come through. Another consequence of Marjorie's decisions. Caitlin had no other choice but to retreat from her plans, unable to fund her way forward. Marjorie knew Caitlin well enough to understand the silence that followed, the anger, the quiet rebellion. She wasn't surprised. It wasn't her job anymore to clean up Caitlin's mess. And then, there was Tina. Marjorie had watched her daughter-in-law start taking extra shifts at the local diner. Her tired eyes and clenched jaw betraying the stress that had begun to wear her down. Tina had always been good at presenting an image of herself, an image of control, of prosperity. But now, that image was crumbling. There were no more easy answers, no more financial lifelines that could be thrown her way. Marjorie didn't feel sympathy for Tina, not anymore. But there was something in the sight of her. working extra shifts, struggling to hold it all together. That felt like the last piece of the puzzle was finally in place. As the week wore on, Marjorie sat back and reflected on the way things had unfolded. The finality of her decisions felt different now, like the stillness of a lake after a storm, its surface finally calm, the ripples slowly fading. She had done what needed to be done, and now, as she sat back in her chair, looking over the papers one last time, she realized that this was the moment of closure she had been waiting for. The family she had once tried to hold together had rejected her, but in that rejection, Marjorie had found her strength. The lessons were clear now, for everyone involved, and as she tucked the papers into a folder, she smiled softly to herself, knowing that, in the end, she had been the one to decide what her legacy would be. The letters from Riley had been coming in a steady stream for months now. Each one was a little more polished, a little more confident than the last. At first, she'd been tentative, her handwriting shaky, her words cautious. But now, as Marjorie read the latest update, she could hear the difference. Riley was thriving at school. She had straight A's in all her classes, a part-time job at the campus bookstore, and a circle of friends who genuinely cared about her. The girl who had once been a shy, withdrawn teenager had transformed into someone else entirely. Someone strong, someone capable, someone who, despite everything, had figured out how to stand on her own 2 feet. Marjorie had always known Riley had it in her, and now, watching her grow, watching her become the person she was always meant to be, brought an unexpected sense of pride. It wasn't just about the money, though it certainly helped. It was about seeing the opportunity turn into something real, something meaningful. Riley was taking what Marjorie had given her and using it to build the future she deserved. To support her, Marjorie sent care packages, simple things, things that Riley might need but might not have thought to ask for. Ramen noodles, quarters for laundry, a few books she thought Riley might enjoy. Each package was packed with small, practical things, but also with handwritten jokes and notes that made Marjorie smile. Simple reminders that, even from a distance, she was there. She was still part of Riley's world. But as Marjorie tucked the latest package into a box and addressed it, a sudden sharp vibration on her phone caught her attention. She hadn't checked her social media in days, hadn't wanted to see any more of what Caitlin had to say. But this time, it was a TikTok video. A short clip posted by Caitlin herself, under the hashtag #SoccerToxicFamily. The video was pure Caitlin, the dramatics turned up to full volume. In the clip, Caitlin spoke directly to the camera, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and hurt. "I never asked for this," she said, shaking her head, eyes wide. "I just wanted a chance to go to school, to do something with my life. But instead, I'm stuck with toxic relatives who take everything away from me and then expect me to be grateful. This is what they want. They want me to fail." The camera angle shifted, and Caitlin's face twisted with emotion, though Marjorie couldn't tell if it was real or just another performance for her audience. "This is what happens when you're raised by selfish people who don't care about you. I'll figure it out. But I won't forget what they've done." The video ended with Caitlin dramatically turning her face away from the camera, her hair falling over her face like a curtain. Marjorie didn't feel the rush of anger that she expected. Instead, she just stared at the screen, her fingers frozen on the phone. It wasn't the first time Caitlin had made her feel like this, like a villain. But now, with the distance that time and decision had provided, Marjorie saw it for what it was. An attempt to grab attention, a desperate cry for validation from a girl who had once been so close to her. She set the phone down, watching as the video disappeared from the screen. Caitlin had her audience now. Caitlin had her way of getting the attention she craved, but it was no longer Marjorie's responsibility to save her. Tina's GoFundMe had reached an end as well. Marjorie had kept an eye on it. just out of curiosity. At first, it had seemed like a desperate, futile effort to raise funds. Caitlin's friends, sympathetic but distant, had contributed a small amount, enough to make the total reach $143. But that, too, had been a fleeting symbol of misplaced pride. Marjorie checked her email the next morning to find a message from Tina. It was short, almost apologetic. "We've taken down the fundraiser. There's no point in continuing. Caitlin will have to figure this out on her own." Marjorie didn't respond. The words had already been spoken. The decisions had already been made. She glanced at the trust papers on the table, where Joelle had just filed the latest quarterly report. Riley's fund was growing steadily. Small, sure, but growing. Marjorie had set it up as a long-term plan, a gift for someone who would value it, who would make it mean something. And Riley was doing just that. Harriet's voice popped into Marjorie's mind. "Want to increase Riley's allowance?" It had been a casual suggestion, made over coffee one afternoon. The thought of it made Marjorie smile, even though she hadn't acted on it. Riley was thriving. She didn't need a handout. She needed time and space to grow. "Not yet," Marjorie said aloud to no one in particular. "She's doing just fine." The phone buzzed again, but this time it was different. This time it was Riley herself, her voice breaking through the noise of Marjorie's world. A voice message, full of excitement and gratitude. "Grandma, I just wanted to say thank you. I got the grades I needed, and I'm so close to being able to get my scholarship for next year. I'm working at the bookstore, saving up, and well, I don't know what to say, except that I'm not giving up. I promise." Marjorie closed her eyes as the message ended. The softness of Riley's voice was the only thing she needed to hear. The rest of the noise, the accusations, the anger, none of it mattered. Riley had chosen a different path, and that path was the one Marjorie had hoped for. It was the only thing that had ever truly mattered. She smiled, long and slow, and placed the phone down. Tomorrow would come with its own challenges, but today felt like the last piece of a puzzle she had spent a lifetime solving. And for the first time in a long time, Marjorie felt like she could finally let go. Marjorie stood in front of her window, the fading light casting long shadows across the lawn. The air was heavy with the sense of something final, something complete, though it wasn't the closure she'd once imagined. No, this was different. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something more. The papers in front of her were evidence of that. She had taken the last step, one she hadn't expected to take when this journey had started. She had always believed in the power of education, the opportunity it could offer. And now, after everything, it felt right to give something back, something meaningful. The email confirmation sat open on her laptop. The funds had been allocated, the endowment officially established. The Marjorie Dean Scholarship for Resilient Women. A simple name, but one that carried the weight of everything she had experienced, everything she had overcome. The scholarship would be for first-generation college students, specifically, young women who had faced obstacles, challenges like those she had seen Riley fight through. The kind of challenges that didn't come with easy solutions or safety nets. The kind of obstacles that Caitlin, with all her privilege, had never truly understood. The decision had been deliberate, considered. It wasn't a grand gesture, but a small act that felt enormous in its simplicity. It was a promise she could keep, a living testament to the values she had held for so long. Riley, with her drive and tenacity, was the perfect first recipient. The scholarship would ensure that others like Riley, the forgotten ones, the overlooked, would have a chance to stand up and be counted. Marjorie had already spoken with the local college about the scholarship's setup. Riley, of course, would be its first ambassador. She deserved that recognition. She had earned it. The phone buzzed on the table beside her. "Caitlin, again. The video from TikTok still haunted her thoughts. The anger, the resentment, the accusations, none of it had been true. Still, Caitlin had her audience, her small group of supporters, her way of twisting the narrative. It was all part of her game, but Marjorie had stopped playing. She'd given up that role long ago. The message from Caitlin's classmate lingered in her mind. Didn't her grandma have, a fund or something? And now it was true, but the fund wasn't for Caitlin. It wasn't for someone who had never appreciated what was given to her. No, this fund was for those who would never take it for granted. Those who would use the opportunity to rise, to build a future. It felt like a quiet victory. Then the phone rang, breaking the stillness. Tina. Marjorie recognized the number, but she hesitated before answering. It had been weeks since their last conversation, and everything had changed. Still, she pressed the green button. So that's it? Tina's voice came through, strained with frustration. You're just going to walk away? You're done? Marjorie didn't respond right away. She let the silence sit between them, the weight of everything she had already said hanging in the air. I'm done, Marjorie said finally, her voice even, calm. Caitlin had her chance. She made her choices. This, what I've done, has nothing to do with you. It's not your responsibility anymore either. There was a long pause on the other end, Tina's breath shaky, as though she was trying to grasp what Marjorie had said. But you can't just leave it like this. You can't just cut us off. I'm not cutting anyone off, Tina. I've already given. I've been giving for years. It's over now. Tina's voice was barely above a whisper. So that's it? That's it, Marjorie replied, her words as steady as the rising tide of calm inside her. You've made your choices, and I've made mine. Tina didn't say anything more. There was nothing more to say. Marjorie had made it clear. The battle was over. Marjorie hung up the phone and exhaled deeply, her chest lighter than it had been in years. The decisions had been made. The chapter with Caitlin and Tina was closed. The next morning, Marjorie took a long walk through the park. She didn't need to worry about the past anymore. As the trees swayed gently above her, she thought of Riley, the first recipient of the scholarship. She thought of the way Riley had started, uncertain and timid, but now, with each letter, each phone call, she was becoming someone strong, someone who would build a future of her own. And then, something shifted within Marjorie, a sense of pride that came not from the past but from the future. The scholarship was her legacy, but Riley was the one who would carry it forward. The promise had been made, and now it was time to watch it unfold. As she returned home, Marjorie found herself smiling. There was no more weight on her shoulders, no more guilt, no more doubt. Everything that had once seemed complicated and tangled was now a clear path forward. The choices she had made had led her here, to a place of peace, a place where she had no regrets. The final piece of the puzzle had fallen into place, and as she opened the door to her house, she knew that whatever came next, she was ready for it. She had done what she had set out to do. And now, it was time for Riley to rise. Marjorie sat at the kitchen table, the soft hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the quiet house. The sun had dipped low, casting the room in a muted golden light. Her pen hovered over the card in front of her, the words struggling to come. It wasn't hard, she realized. It was just different. The way Riley had transformed from the shy, uncertain girl into someone who was ready to take on the world was nothing short of remarkable. And Marjorie wanted her to know, wanted her to feel it, that she belonged there, at that school, in that life she was creating for herself. She glanced down at the card in her hand. Simple, with a soft floral design, nothing too extravagant. She didn't need the words to be grand, She needed them to be real. She had been thinking about this for days, about what she wanted to say as Riley prepared for the next step, her dorm move. She had already sent the usual care packages, ramen, books, some snacks, but this card would be different. It was time for something personal, something that Riley could keep, something that was hers. Her pen finally hit the paper. Riley, I'm so proud of you. You belong here. You always did. Marjorie paused, feeling the weight of those words. You belong here. She hadn't said that to anyone in a long time, hadn't felt it for herself in years. But Riley was different. Riley had earned it. She closed her eyes for a moment, imagining Riley's reaction to this simple message. Would it sink in the way it was meant? Would she realize, as she read it, that all the love and effort Marjorie had put into her over the years was real, and that, despite everything, she was a part of this world? Marjorie set the pen down, turning the card over. She tucked in a crisp $500 bill, just cash, no strings, no expectations. Riley had everything ahead of her, and the money was just a small gesture to ease the stress of the first few weeks. As Marjorie sealed the envelope, she felt a stirring in her chest, something that she couldn't quite name. Was it pride? Relief? Maybe both. She could feel the warmth in her chest, as if the moment itself had a light of its own. The phone buzzed. It was FaceTime. Riley's name flashed on the screen. Marjorie took a deep breath and hit the accept button. The screen flickered, and soon Riley's familiar face appeared, a bright smile lighting up her eyes. She looked different somehow. More grown up. Less uncertain. "Grandma!" Riley's voice cracked with emotion, her eyes shimmering as she leaned forward, a little too excited, a little too eager. "I got your card. I can't believe you wrote me that. It means everything. You don't know how much it means." Marjorie smiled, her own eyes welling with unshed tears. She hadn't realized how much she needed this, how much she needed to know Riley was okay, that she was on her way. "You've earned it, Riley. I'm so proud of you. You belong there. Always have." Riley wiped her eyes quickly, laughing through the tears. This is crazy. I never thought I'd be here, you know? I never thought I'd be the person who made it. But now I am. And it's because of you." Marjorie didn't know what to say to that. She had always believed in Riley, always knew that she was capable of so much, but hearing it from Riley herself, hearing her say it with such conviction, filled something in Marjorie that had been empty for too long. "I'm not giving up, Grandma, I swear," Riley said, her voice more confident now. "I'm going to finish this. I'm going to make you proud." Marjorie's heart swelled. "You already have, Riley. Just keep going. That's all I ask." They both smiled at each other for a long moment. No words needed. Marjorie watched as Riley wiped away another tear, then gave a soft laugh, shaking her head. "Sorry, I'm so grateful, Grandma. I really am. I can't say it enough." Marjorie took a slow, steady breath. The emotional knot she hadn't realized she'd been holding was starting to loosen. This was the moment she had been working toward, the one where she knew, without a doubt, that Riley would take everything and do something with it. The call ended after a few more minutes of laughter and promises to talk soon, and Marjorie sat back in her chair, letting out a deep breath, her hands still resting on her lap. The screen of her phone faded to black, and for a brief moment the quietness of the room filled her senses. Marjorie stood up, walking slowly to the hallway. There, on the wall, were pictures from the past, images of Caitlin and Riley, young and full of possibility. The contrast between the two was glaring, but there was no bitterness in Marjorie's heart now. Just clarity. She had done all she could, given all she had, and now Riley would carry forward what had been promised. She wasn't sad, exactly. There was no grief, no regret. But there was something. A soft recognition that this was the way it was meant to be. The past, with all its mistakes and missteps, was behind her. What mattered now was the future, the one Riley was building. Marjorie reached for the photo frame on the counter, the one with Riley's hand-drawn card inside. She held it in her hands for a long moment, feeling the weight of everything it represented. And then, without any more hesitation, she smiled to herself and turned away, knowing that whatever came next, she had made the right choice. This was her legacy, and Riley, more than anyone, would carry it forward. The mailman arrived at the same time every morning, like clockwork, his worn shoes tapping across the sidewalk with an old rhythm. Marjorie sat by the window, a steaming mug of tea in hand, watching the world slowly shift into another ordinary day. The world outside was still, bathed in the quiet of early morning, but Marjorie could feel the quiet stirrings of something new deep inside her. A moment was coming. She could sense it. The calm before the last of the storm. The point where everything finally clicked. The mailman was walking up her driveway now, and Marjorie shifted in her seat, her eyes following the familiar figure as he approached the porch. He tipped his cap, nodding politely, before placing a bundle of letters on her doorstep. She hadn't even stood up before she could tell. She could see the envelope from the window, the familiar green insignia of the college Riley had been applying to. Her heart quickened. The moment had arrived. Marjorie set her cup down with a quiet clink, walked over to the door, and opened it. The fresh morning air hit her face, clean and sharp. She bent down to pick up the mail, her fingers brushing over the crisp white envelope. She already knew what it was. She could feel it. The small weight of the papers inside, the confirmation that Riley's future was beginning to unfold. The front of the envelope had her name on it, but it wasn't the one she expected. In the bottom corner was the line, "Funding sponsor, Marjorie Dean." For a long moment, she just stared at it. Her name, next to the promise of a future Riley would now build. It felt surreal, as though she were seeing it through someone else's eyes. But it was real. She had done this. She had given Riley the chance she had never had. The satisfaction was quiet, deep. Marjorie had always imagined some grand, dramatic moment would accompany this feeling. But no, it was far more peaceful than that. She opened the envelope carefully, the papers unfolding inside. Riley had been accepted. She had earned it. The words on the page were as simple as they were profound. "Congratulations. Your acceptance to university name has been confirmed." Marjorie could feel her chest tighten with emotion, but it wasn't sadness. It wasn't even joy. It was something more like contentment, a feeling that settled deep into her bones. This was the legacy she had worked for, the one she had always wanted to build. The one that would last long after the noise had faded. She set the papers down and poured herself another cup of tea, the steam swirling gently into the air, the weight of the moment washing over her in a wave of quiet satisfaction. The kettle hissed gently as it boiled, and as she sat back down, she opened her crossword book. The words blurred for a moment as the faintest smile tugged at the corner of her lips. For the first time in years, the crossword felt like a welcome distraction, a sign of normalcy, of peace. The phone rang just then. Marjorie picked it up without looking at the caller ID. It was Harriet's number. "Marjorie, you're a quiet hurricane," Harriet said with that familiar, dry humor. Marjorie's lips curled into a smile. "No," she replied, the words soft but firm. "Just a woman who remembers things." There was a moment of silence on the other end, then Harriet's voice, warm and understanding. "I'm proud of you. You did the right thing." Marjorie nodded, though Harriet couldn't see her. She didn't need to. It was the right thing. and the decision had been made long ago. Now the consequences were unfolding exactly as they should. Riley was thriving, and she would continue to thrive. I know, Marjorie replied softly. I just had to wait for them to see it. Another moment passed, the silence thick but comfortable. Harriet, as always, understood. The sun had set by the time Marjorie placed the acceptance letter on the mantel. The house was quiet now, but it wasn't empty. She had given Riley the tools to build a future, to make a life, to be someone she could be proud of. And somewhere deep inside her, Marjorie knew. Caitlin's words, the video, the public shaming, it all didn't matter anymore. None of it. The choices had already been made. Caitlin had chosen her path, and Marjorie had chosen hers. Her mind drifted back to the words Caitlin had spoken so many months ago. She's outdated. Marjorie stood still for a moment, her gaze fixed on the mantel. The weight of those words, the resentment, the accusations, they had lost their power. Her granddaughter rolled her eyes and said, "She's outdated." But her college fund, this legacy, had said otherwise. And that was all that mattered now. Marjorie closed her eyes briefly, letting the stillness wash over her, the finality of everything coming into focus. She had done the right thing. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't loud, but it was real, it was solid. And now, Riley's future was waiting.